Hi everyone and welcome back to Snippit Sports Science, proudly sponsored by EliteForm.com. EliteForm is a velocity-based camera system with an online strength planner. Make sure you check them out at EliteForm.com if you're into your velocity-based training. The last few episodes we've been focusing on the concept of ischemic preconditioning. I've been really enjoying putting these little mini-series together. And the first episode was the interview with Sam Halley, just introducing the concept of ischemic preconditioning. And we went through around the use of it with kayak performance. And I think, as you would attest to if you listen to Sam's podcast, some really simple interventions with BFR and some really great outcomes around performance, especially when you're performing a couple of times within a day. And then we moved into the last podcast was around ischemic preconditioning and resistance training session performance. And what I really liked about that, because I've read a few articles on IPC, and to be honest, it's quite equivocal as to whether it has success in relation to some sort of performance, in particular resistance training. It seems to lean more towards longer sessions or aerobic sessions. And if you listen to the last podcast, it was using a resistance training session as opposed to other studies which looked at IPC around one or two exercises only. Therefore, I thought that reviewing that article had greater relevance to what we would see when we're training athletes. The last two articles have been around acute IPC and performance, whether it's something aerobic or weight training. Therefore, I thought it'd be a great chance to look at what happens when we spread this out a little bit longer. And the article that I'm going to review today is around 7 days or a week, and it's actually called The Effect of 1 week of repeated ischemic leg preconditioning on simulated Keirin cycling performance, a randomised trial.
Now, going on to the article, when we think about the concept of ischemic preconditioning, this is where they have repetitions of using pressure to induce brief ischemia, that's hypoxia or reduced oxygen, followed by reperfusion, or in other words, reoxygenation. This technique has been shown to increase exercise capacity through alterations in oxygen delivery, blood flow, and fatigue attenuation, and also has been shown to result in improved peak oxygen uptake and peak and main power during early stages of repeat sprint cycling. Everyone loves to know mechanisms as to why it works, and I really try to explain it. And sometimes science may miss the real reason or the real mechanism as to why something works. And in my industry, although I try to put a lot of science behind what I do, sometimes if something works, I think it's worth keep exploring. And also something to remember with BFR, there's responders and non-responders. And that's really important to understand with BFR or any type of training stimulus. So with respect to ischemic preconditioning, oxidative stress is an integral component of this ischemic and reperfusion cycle, while vasodilation improves tissue oxygenation. And the inflammatory system modulation is regulated through a single or repetitive ischemic treatment. Now, there's lots of different type of markers that we can look at here and different metabolites. So I think what's important is not to get bogged down in this. There's things such as oxidative stress, immune system activation, and also other markers such as nitric oxide and catecholamine synthesis. And once again, these biomarkers provide insight into mechanisms as to why it works. Markers get activated during a certain activity. I think that's a positive thing. However, I think putting our pragmatic coach's hat on, we just need to look at A, do the athletes like it? And B, does it produce a performance benefit? Or perhaps the other way around. With respect to this paper, the purpose was to assess an induced physiological change and simulated Keirin cycling performance following 7 days of ischemic preconditioning. And they also wanted to see if it could determine if any aerobic capacity changes remained after an additional 7 days. With respect to the participants, they used 18 recreational active sports science students, 13 men, 5 women, aged between 18 and 30 years of age. Now, as we know, ideally we love elite athletes, but in most studies this isn't possible, so therefore we need to look within the results. The experimental design was a randomized sham-controlled design, which was used to assess the impact of 7 consecutive days of ischemic preconditioning sessions on urinary markers of physiological stress, those markers which I told you not to stress about, and simulated competition cycling performance measured through repeated anaerobic exercise performances. With respect to testing, baseline aerobic, VO2 max, and anaerobic capacity, so that's a 30-second wind gate test. That's on a cycle ergometer. Cycle as hard and as fast as you can for 30 seconds. They were performed 48 and 24 hours respectively prior to commencing the ischemic preconditioning protocol. Now, the participants were pair matched by the investigator, but they were then randomly allocated into a treatment or a sham group. Now, the sham group they still had cuffs on, but it was a really low pressure. Participants were told that it was an ischemic preconditioning study using blood pressure cuffs. However, they were not told what pressure would be expected to be an effective treatment. Furthermore, the participants were unaware as to which treatment group they were in. The prescribed sessions were performed once a day over the following 7 days. After completing all the 7 ischemic preconditioning treatments, the participants performed a simulated Keirin test, which is 4 by 30 second wind gate tests, 24 hours post, and a second and third VO2 max at 48 hours, and then a following 7 days post. So here, they've had their 7-day treatment of ischemic preconditioning, and then at 24 hours post, they did 4 30-second wind gate tests, so the simulated Keirin test. At 48 hours, they did a VO2 max, and then the following 7 days, they've done another VO2 max. As I mentioned earlier, the participants performed their testing, their VO2 max, and their initial 30-second wind gate test. It's also important to note here the participants completed a visual analog scale questionnaire, or VAS questionnaire, of a scale of 0 to 10, which looked at fatigue pre, post, and 30 minutes post, where 0 represented no fatigue, while a 10 represented greatest fatigue possible. There was no familiarization testing done here, but they did indicate that they were sports science students. In the study here, they thought that using the 4 wind gate tests replicated the time scale and simulated a Keirin competition quite well. Also, blood lactate was collected before, immediately post, and 5 minutes post each wind gate, while urine was collected pre, immediately post, and 30 minutes post each wind gate test, as well as 24 hours post. Peak power, average power, and fatigue index percentage was calculated for each wind gate test, while participants were also completed that same VAS questionnaire pre-post and 30 minutes post. So really trying to get an accurate marker from a subjective, but also an objective viewpoint. Now, revisiting the repeated ischemic preconditioning protocol, it was actually really simple. The cuff was 20 centimeters wide, where participants received 4 5-minute episodes of ischemic preconditioning at 220 millimeters of mercury, or the other group was a sham treatment at 20 millimeters of mercury, interspersed with 5 minutes of reperfusion per episode. And that actually alternated between each thigh. During the 7-day ischemic preconditioning protocol, they were allowed to continue their normal activity. However, this was just done passive, so it's really important to notice here, and that's the advantage of using ischemic preconditioning. It is all passive type treatment. Now on to the most important thing, the results here. The follow-up testing showed that in anaerobic measures, the comparison between the pre-ischemic preconditioning and the best 30-second wind gate of the Keirin simulation revealed peak power increased 11%, average power 4.3, and fatigue index 12.1 in the ischemic preconditioning, and these were all significant changes, while no changes were observed for the sham group for any of these parameters. Both groups reported a greater perceived feeling of fatigue 30 minutes following the first Keirin wind gate test, despite no significant changes in lactate measures for either group between the pre-ischemic preconditioning and the first Keirin wind gate test. With respect to aerobic measures, maximal aerobic capacity increased 9.5% 48 hours post-ischemic preconditioning treatment, with a further increase to 12.8% above baseline after initial 7 days. That's quite good, isn't it? You have an increase in aerobic capacity by doing nothing. These are all significant changes. The ischemic preconditioning treatment also showed a small effect on increasing maximal aerobic power, which peaked 18.5% above baseline 48 hours post-intervention, before regressing slightly back to 16.1% 7 days later. No significant differences were found for maximal heart rate or respiratory exchange ratio values in either group during any of the VO2 max tests. With respect to the Keirin event simulation, so that's 4 30-second efforts on the wind gate so-called ergometer, the ischemic preconditioning group significantly increased their peak power by 8.7% in tests 3 and 4, while there were no significant changes in the sham or control group. Average power had a significant but trivial increase for Wingates 3 and 4 when compared with Wingate 1 and 2. So that's 3.2 to 3.4% respectively. However, there was no changes observed for the sham group. Once again here, although slight increases in performance, there's something going on here with ischemic preconditioning. The ratings of perceived fatigue showed similar within group trends as both groups experienced increased levels of fatigue at specific time points. The sham group had higher blood lactate concentrations prior to test 2, which is indicative of another study out there which seemed to indicate there was perhaps some buffering mechanism going on with ischemic preconditioning. As we can see here, these results suggest that 7 consecutive days of ischemic preconditioning may provide an ergogenic benefit. However, the authors do go on to say that the optimal conditioning required to elicit a performance or physiological adaptation is yet to be investigated. Now, of course, that's to be obvious, but when you actually look at some other studies here, there was some authors who noted that a single application of leg ischemia improves maximal oxygen consumption by 3% and aerobic power output by 1.6%. When you compare it to this study here, the within treatment group improvement of 12.8% in maximal oxygen consumption and an 18.5% enhancement in aerobic power, you would actually say that this effect of ischemic preconditioning is improved over a longer period of time. With respect to the biochemical markers, it's well established that ischemic preconditioning results in cellular and genetic adaptations providing protection against hypoxic stress. In an exercise-related context where significant elevations in oxidative stress accompany various forms of activities, the adaptation potentially developed through repeated ischemic preconditioning may have increased the cell's ability to modulate the physiological stress response and more efficiently improve exercise capacity and performance through oxidative stress-dependent mechanisms. Now, some of the markers here, so neopatrin and biopatrin, these were shown to increase over the week while undertaking the ischemic preconditioning treatment, which indicates that while oxidative stress was increased, there was minimal immune system activation or nitric oxide or catecholamine synthesis. The repeated ischemic preconditioning resulted in lower levels of indirect markers of oxidative stress during the Keirin stimulation. This may explain the ability to maintain a higher peak power and reduce the decrement in average power over successive sprints. Increased reactive oxygen species, such as those produced during high-intensity exercise, has been shown to modulate skeletal muscle force production, while the immune system activation is known to detrimentally affect the same mechanical properties. It could be postulated that the smaller perturbations in inflammation and oxidative stress experienced in the ischemic preconditioning group had a smaller impact on the contractile properties of the skeletal muscle, allowing for more sustainable and repeatable anaerobic performance. Repeated ischemic preconditioning also resulted in a significant elevation in urinary total biopatrin. This suggests that an increased vasodilation and sympathetic activation as previously noted. This may increase oxygen delivery and saturation. The repeated ischemic preconditioning also resulted in a significant elevation in urinary total biopatrin, suggesting increased vasodilation and sympathetic activation. This may increase oxygen delivery and saturation within the exercise and skeletal muscle tissue or enhancement of contraction function, which was also observed between successive bouts. The likely increase in vasodilation and subsequent oxygen delivery in conjunction with previously reported increased blood vessel density in response to repeated IPC hypoxic conditions may provide an explanation for the improvement in aerobic capacity. What this is actually saying that through these markers, it's actually indicating that you are able to increase the oxygen delivery and saturation within the skeletal muscle, and this in turn enhances the contractile function of the muscle. And I guess that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to improve the contractile function of the body, and in this case, the muscles. Therefore, in summary, the results here show that 7 days of passive ischemic preconditioning, 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, substantially improved aerobic and anaerobic capacity, and it also showed improvement in certain anaerobic capacity parameters over 4 successive anaerobic bouts. Those are 4 30-second Wingate tests. The markers that were measured here also indicated that there was an improvement in oxygen delivery, which perhaps explain the results seen in the Wingate test. So when you sit down and just reflect on this paper, I kind of think about this as money for jam. Are we doing the 1%ers or the 2%ers? Are we doing something that we should be doing that has no physical cost to us? It's like sleeping well and eating well. it's been shown IPC, ischemic preconditioning, or just BFR, has been shown to have very few side effects, only in extreme or poorly controlled cases. Therefore, why not do it? Why not try it? Are you one of the responders? Because if you're able to sit down and do something that's as easy as this, why aren't we doing it? It kind of makes sense. With respect to the protocols I use, I do something a little bit more realistic. So I go 2 minutes on, 1 minute off, and do that 3 times. And I found that the response from the athletes are very favorable and positive. Would it be better if it's 5 on, 5 off? Well, only time would tell and a detailed study. However, I think we live in a practical world. If you think about a 5 minute on and off protocol 3 times, that's about 25, 30 minutes versus 2 on, 1 off, 3 times through, that's about 8 minutes. So I just say, well, it's just your Instagram or your social media time. They can just flick through that while they're getting their bag ready. Now, also, one thing I've noticed in athletes is that they require more intensity. And so if they feel that they're a non-responder doing it passively, why not give them a small active type circuit? And that could be something as simple as a little mini band routine, single leg squats. Create something that would have benefit to them anyway, and that would only be amplified using BFR. Now, it wouldn't be 2 minutes on, 1 minute off, but you'd create a circuit and you'd reperfuse for a minute off, reinflate 3 times through. And once again, as people have indicated when they use BFR, that it feels great. Everything feels active. If they've got any joint pain, that decreases, the muscles are nice and warm and supportive. I think this is a great application of BFR, and I urge you, if you do have a set of cuffs, try it out. The worst thing that could happen is that, well, you perform better, and wouldn't that be a great thing?
Hope you found that article interesting and really highlights that if we look at a more longitudinal approach to IPC, that we could potentially see some really good benefits there. And a cheeky little plug, if you are interested in more blood flow restriction information, I actually have another podcast called BFR Radio, so please search for that on Spotify or iTunes. And you can also head to my website, which is sportsrehab.com.au. And I actually sell blood flow restriction cuffs. I have my own Sports Rehab Tourniquet range for upper and lower body training. And I have tons of information if you want to get into it and start your own BFR training. And I like to think I'm quite approachable and have quite a lot of information for you to be able to implement BFR in your own particular setting. Thanks again for listening. Thanks to eliteform.com for sponsoring the podcast. If you are enjoying this podcast, please share it to your friends, tell them all about it. And the usual iTunes plug, please give it a rating. I know that when I listen to podcasts myself, I'm usually tuned off by this stage, but if you are listening and you have got a little bit of spare time, head to iTunes and give us a favorable rating. We'd really appreciate that. We'll see you in a couple of weeks' time for our second last episode on ischemic preconditioning, a slight different variation of it. And I think you'd be quite surprised with the next episode on what passive BFR could do for you. Thanks for listening.